The dawn broke in muted grey, spreading its light reluctantly across the prisoner-of-war camp set in the flat lands of the Midwest. A sharp wind moved through the wire fences, rattling loose strands like brittle bones. The air carried the smell of damp earth and burned coffee drifting from the guardhouse. Private Daniel Harris walked his patrol slowly, boots pressing against gravel that crunched in steady rhythm. His eyes lingered on the barracks, where dozens of Japanese prisoners slept under the weight of both defeat and discipline. Harris was 23, a farm boy from Ohio who had never imagined he would trade cornfields for watchtowers. The war had hardened many of his peers, but he still carried a softness in his gaze, a reluctance to view every man inside the wire as nothing more than an enemy. That weakness, as others called it, gnawed at him each time he caught himself wondering about the lives those prisoners once led, about the families who must have waited oceans away. The morning felt no different from the others until his attention caught on a small movement near the fence line. One of the prisoners, a slender man with weary shoulders, bent down as if to tie his boot, though something in the action was guarded, too careful. Harris's hand tensed on the strap of his rifle. The wind carried the sound of shuffling feet, and the man straightened quickly, clutching something to his chest. Harris narrowed his eyes. It was not contraband food, nor a weapon, but a piece of paper worn at the edges. The prisoner pressed it close, as though it were fragile beyond words. For a second their eyes met, and Harris glimpsed a flash of fear mixed with fierce determination. The guard stepped closer, the gravel biting underfoot. The prisoner retreated into the line of others, still clutching the object. The morning roll call went on as usual, yet Harris's thoughts clung stubbornly to the mystery. What could a man risk punishment to protect so dearly? He had seen prisoners hide cigarettes, scraps of bread, even stolen pencils. This seemed different. This seemed personal. After roll call, as the prisoners marched back under watch, Harris scanned for the same man. He found him, thin, his uniform patched at the elbows, head bowed like the rest. The object had disappeared into the folds of his clothes. Harris felt the tug of curiosity pressing against the strict orders drilled into him. Confiscate everything unauthorized, trust nothing, doubt everything. And yet, something within him whispered that this small act was not rebellion, but memory. His boots carried him back toward the watchtower, but his mind was far from routine. Each clang of the gate behind the prisoners echoed with questions. He thought of the letters he kept folded inside his own pocket, letters from his mother, written in looping handwriting that smelled faintly of soap and kitchen spices. He carried them like a lifeline, a reminder that beyond the endless duty and suspicion, there still existed warmth and belonging. Could the paper in that prisoner's hand be his lifeline? The camp settled into its rhythm, guards rotating posts, prisoners moving in ordered silence toward their work details. Harris climbed the steps to his station, heart still unsettled. The object had been small, perhaps the size of a wallet photo. The way the man clutched it, not with greed but with reverence, lodged deep inside Harris's chest. The sky grew brighter, the wind colder, and yet his thoughts refused to leave that image. He could not know then that this single moment, a guard noticing a prisoner with a photograph, would ripple through the camp like a hidden current. He could not know how one choice, his choice, would blur the lines between guard and captive, enemy and man. And so it began, with a photograph held in trembling hands, and a question that would not let Daniel Harris rest. If you want to keep following this powerful story of humanity during war, make sure to subscribe to the channel now, because what happens next will change everything. Private Daniel Harris wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed the weight of a rifle slung across his shoulder, or the sharp glare of watchful eyes on him at all times. He had been born in Ohio, where the air was always thick with the scent of freshly tilled soil, and the mornings seemed to stretch out lazily, filled with the hum of cicadas and the creak of old barn doors. His family had lived on a small farm outside the town of Greenville. His father, a stern man who rarely showed affection, believed in hard work above all else. His mother, in contrast, was a quiet woman who spoke to him in soft tones, always caring, always patient. Daniel had always been the quieter one, the one who found more solace in the company of animals than in the rough and tumble of schoolyards or the boisterous chatter of his peers. He had worked alongside his father, fixing fences and milking cows, with his hands calloused by farm labor. When the war came, he was drafted without much thought, like many young men in rural towns. It was just something that happened, a duty that had to be fulfilled. His father had nodded grimly when he received his draft notice, his mother's eyes filled with a quiet sadness. But here, in the vast, flat landscape of a POW camp, everything was different. Harris was stationed as a guard at the camp overseeing Japanese prisoners of war. His days were long and filled with monotonous patrols, yet the silence around him seemed to cut deeper each day. The tension between the prisoners and the guards was palpable, an unspoken animosity that filled every corner of the camp. Harris felt it in the way his fellow soldiers looked at the POWs, with suspicion, anger, and sometimes even disgust. Sergeant Thomas Miller, who had seen far more combat than Harris, never missed an opportunity to remind him of his place. "This ain't a damn vacation, kid," he'd often say, his voice rough and guttural. "They're the enemy. Remember that." Harris didn't need reminding. He knew that the Japanese prisoners weren't his friends, nor were they supposed to be. But something inside him, something deeper than duty, couldn't ignore the quiet desperation in their eyes, the same desperation he had seen in the eyes of men back home who had lost their families to the Great Depression. He didn't speak much about it, and he certainly didn't show it to anyone else. But the feeling of alienation, of knowing he didn't quite fit with the soldiers around him, grew heavier with each passing day. Lieutenant Robert McKinley, his commanding officer, noticed Harris's hesitations. A man who had seen the worst of war, McKinley was distant and authoritative, always quick with orders but slow to offer praise. He was a professional, a man who kept his feelings tucked neatly under the surface. "You're not here to make friends with them," McKinley had said one afternoon as they sat together on a break. "You're here to make sure they stay in line." Harris had nodded, but a part of him couldn't silence the doubts. He had never been one to follow orders blindly. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Always be kind, always show respect. But here, in this war-torn world, kindness felt like a distant memory. The days bled together, each one indistinguishable from the last. Harris's routine remained unchanged. Wake up before dawn, march through the camp, keep a watchful eye on the prisoners as they went about their daily tasks. He saw the Japanese men lined up in rows, always quiet, always controlled. They seemed distant, as though they existed in a world of their own, a world where they were bound by honor and the relentless weight of the war. There were moments when Harris caught glimpses of their lives beyond the barbed wire. Sometimes when he walked past the barracks, he heard the faint murmur of voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. The tone was soft, respectful. They spoke of home, of family, of the things they had lost. He wondered sometimes what their lives had been like before the war, before they had been reduced to prisoners, caught in the machinery of a conflict they never chose. But these moments were fleeting. Duty always called him back to the present, to the narrow, rigid world of camp life. He told himself he couldn't afford to think too much about the prisoners as people. They were enemies, and enemies were to be watched, contained. Yet despite his best efforts to keep his distance, he found his thoughts straying back to the photograph, the one he had seen the night before. That night, as he lay in his bunk, staring up at the dim ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of the prisoner holding the photo. Harris had seen it before in his own life, tucked in the corners of old frames at his mother's house. The photograph was a tether, a piece of home. It was a small thing, yet it held the weight of everything: memories, family, love. He wondered what it meant for a man to clutch such an object in the middle of a war, to hold on to a piece of his past with such ferocity. As the hours passed, Harris's mind drifted and the weight of the photo hung over him like a shadow. What if, despite the uniform, despite the barbed wire, they were not so different after all? The camp was a small world, isolated from the rest of the country, built on flat, barren land where nothing grew but dust. The barbed wire fences loomed like iron giants, wrapping around the camp like a cage, separating those inside from the world outside. The air was thick with tension, a constant reminder of the war that raged beyond these walls. The ground was hard, cracked in places, and the weather seemed to match the mood, grey and unyielding, as if even the sky was unwilling to offer warmth or reprieve. Private Harris had grown used to the harshness of it all, though the discomfort of the place never seemed to leave him. Every morning he walked the same path, his boots crunching against the gravel, the wind tugging at his uniform as if trying to pull him back home. The POWs moved in tight formations, their heads low, their eyes cast downward in submission. They were always silent, always controlled. It was a strange sort of order, one that felt more like a pressure cooker than a place of safety. Harris noticed the way the prisoners stood at attention whenever a guard approached. Their backs straight, their hands clasped behind them, their faces unreadable. They were men, just like him, but they seemed like shadows of themselves, their humanity obscured by the uniform of their enemy. He wondered how they managed to hold on to themselves in such a place. The barracks were long, dark structures that seemed to swallow up any light that tried to enter. Inside, the air was musty and stale, filled with the scent of sweat and fear. Harris had only been inside once, during a routine inspection, and he remembered how the prisoners moved quietly between their small bunks, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when spoken to. It was a place of regimented silence, where the sound of a cough or a sneeze felt like a betrayal of the unwritten rules that governed their lives. Sergeant Miller walked beside him, his boots loud against the gravel. He was a man who had long since given up on any pretense of kindness. "Don't expect any thanks from these guys," Miller said, spitting into the dirt. "They don't care about anything but their orders. You've got to keep your distance, Harris. Keep your head down and do your job." Harris nodded, but the words didn't sit right with him. He had heard them before, from other guards who had been stationed here longer than he had. They had all adopted the same cold, detached attitude. It was easier that way, they said. Easier to do what needed to be done when you didn't think too much about it. But Harris couldn't seem to shut off the part of him that still questioned things, that still saw people as people, no matter the uniform they wore. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the camp as Harris continued his patrol. He passed the mess hall, where a handful of prisoners were gathered, standing in line for their daily ration. The guards moved in a tight formation, watching every movement, every flicker of an eye. Harris couldn't help but notice the way the prisoners held their hands at their sides, fingers trembling slightly, as if they feared the smallest mistake would lead to punishment. It was a nervous tension that seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. The camp was a place where fear thrived. It was a place where men, broken by war, were reduced to nothing more than faces behind fences. But Harris didn't want to see it that way. He didn't want to believe that these men who had families, homes, lives, were nothing more than pawns in a game they never chose to play. As he passed the watchtower, Harris's eyes caught sight of Captain Hiroshi Takeda, the leader of the Japanese POWs. Takeda stood near the center of the camp, his back straight, his eyes scanning the perimeter. His presence was commanding, even from a distance. There was an air of dignity about him, despite the dirt on his uniform and the weariness in his gaze. He held himself differently from the others, calm, collected, as if he had not yet given up on honor. Harris watched him for a moment, his thoughts drifting again to the photograph. Takeda was a man like any other, and yet here he stood, imprisoned, stripped of his identity by the war. The photograph had meant something to him. Harris was certain of it. But what? What was it that connected these men to their pasts, to their families, to their lives before the war? The sound of footsteps behind him snapped him back to reality. It was Lieutenant McKinley, his face set in a stern expression. "Harris," he called, his voice carrying across the camp. "Keep your focus. This isn't a place for distractions." Harris turned to face him, offering a quick salute. "Yes, sir." McKinley eyed him for a moment, his gaze sharp. "Stay alert. Don't let your guard down." "Yes, sir," Harris repeated, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Something inside him was unsettled, a gnawing sensation that grew with each passing day. As McKinley walked away, Harris found himself standing there, staring at the prisoners lined up in front of the mess hall. Their faces were unreadable, their bodies stiff with the strain of their captivity. For a moment he wondered if they, too, saw him as just another soldier, just another part of the machinery that kept them imprisoned. But even if they did, he couldn't help but feel that there was more to them than just enemies. There was something human there, something worth remembering. The wind howled across the camp, carrying with it the bitter cold of the approaching winter. The day moved forward, the routine of the camp pressing down on Harris like the weight of the world. But his thoughts lingered on the prisoners, on Takeda and on that photograph. The pieces of this strange puzzle were starting to come together in ways that Harris didn't yet understand. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for the answers. The photograph had stayed with Harris all night, lingering in his thoughts, tugging at him like an invisible thread. The image he had glimpsed, fragile and worn, had become a symbol, something more than just paper and ink. He couldn't stop thinking about it, about what it represented. To him, it felt like a secret, a personal link to a life outside the camp, a life before the war. It was clear that the man who had clutched it had known exactly what he was doing, protecting something precious, something irreplaceable. Harris had thought about it, turning it over in his mind. He hadn't planned to act on it, not at first. But the more he thought about it, the more he found himself questioning everything. He had seen the prisoners in their barracks, heard the soft, respectful murmurs of their voices. And now this photograph, it all seemed to point to a humanity that he wasn't supposed to acknowledge. That morning, as Harris patrolled the fence, his thoughts grew heavier. The photograph had become a symbol of something he couldn't ignore. A life, a family, a past that existed beyond the cold, steel fences of the camp. He had seen it all before, in his own life. Pictures of his family, his mother's smile, his father's stern face. These were the things that kept a person anchored to the world, that made the impossible distances between life and war bearable. The sun was climbing higher in the sky when Harris spotted the man again, the prisoner he had noticed earlier, the one who had held the photograph. This time, the man wasn't alone. He was with a small group of others, all standing in line, hands at their sides, eyes fixed straight ahead. The man, whose name Harris still didn't know, looked no different from the others, tired, worn, just another face in a sea of unfamiliar faces. But it was the way he moved, the way he held himself, that caught Harris's attention. He wasn't like the others. There was something about him, a quiet dignity that set him apart. The photograph he had protected so fiercely seemed to radiate from him, even if only in the smallest ways. His posture, the careful way he avoided eye contact, the way he carried himself with a kind of restrained pride. Harris hesitated, standing just outside the fence line, watching. The camp felt still, like a stage frozen in time, waiting for something to happen. It was then that Harris made a decision. He couldn't leave things as they were. He had to know more. He took a step forward, then another, moving toward the man who had caught his attention. His heart beat a little faster now, not from fear, but from something else. Something like an impulse, an understanding, or maybe even a need to make some kind of connection. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that for the first time in a long while he wasn't going to stand by and watch. As he approached, Harris saw the man's eyes flicker toward him, but only briefly, just long enough for Harris to catch the glimmer of recognition there. The prisoner seemed to take a breath, as though bracing for something, but then he lowered his gaze again, as was expected, as was the rule in the camp. His hands stayed stiff at his sides. Harris stopped just a few feet away, unsure of what to say. He could feel the weight of his uniform, the eyes of the other prisoners on him. It was a strange feeling, this sense of both power and helplessness at the same time. He could arrest this man for any number of things, but in this moment there was nothing but the photograph between them, an unspoken understanding that Harris could feel, even if the prisoner never spoke a word. "Your photograph," Harris said softly, almost to himself. He wasn't sure why he had said it, but it felt like the right thing to do. The man's head snapped up slightly, just enough to let Harris know he had heard. His face didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of surprise, then wariness. The man opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, unsure of how to respond. Harris stepped a little closer, lowering his voice even more. "It's important to you, isn't it? The prisoner's gaze dropped again, and for a moment the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Harris could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. There was something fragile about this moment, something that could break, something that could change everything. The man finally nodded, the smallest of gestures, but it was enough. Harris felt the sudden urge to do something, anything to show that he understood, that he didn't see this man as just a prisoner, just an enemy. This wasn't about the war or the uniform, it was about what lay beneath it all. Harris reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully, and pulled out the photograph. The moment it left his pocket, the man's eyes went wide and his hand shot out, fingers trembling. He stopped just short of taking it, and for a moment, their eyes met. Harris's uncertain, the prisoner's filled with silent gratitude. Without thinking, Harris pressed the photograph into the man's palm. Their fingers brushed for an instant, and that touch, that fleeting connection, spoke more than any words could have. The prisoner looked at the photograph, then back at Harris. His lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. Harris nodded once, quickly, and turned away, heart pounding. It was done. He had made a choice, a simple one, but a choice nonetheless. And somehow, in that brief moment, he felt as though he had bridged a gap that had existed between them from the very start. As he walked back to his post, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just between him and the prisoner, but inside himself as well. There was no going back now. The photograph had become something more than a token of home. It had become a symbol of the humanity that bound them all together, in ways neither side had expected. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him after that brief interaction with the prisoner. The photograph felt like a doorway, one that once opened couldn't be closed again. He had done something small but personal, something that had connected him to the man across the fence. It felt right. But as the hours passed, doubt began to creep in, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Was it the right choice? What would happen if someone found out? As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the camp, Harris's unease grew. He walked his patrol, but his thoughts wandered, looping back to the moment he had handed over the photograph. He could still feel the trembling of the prisoner's fingers as they brushed against his own, still hear the silence that had hung between them. It had been a simple exchange, nothing dramatic, nothing that would seem like a betrayal to anyone who hadn't been there. But to Harris it felt like a line had been crossed. Then came the knock. It was sharp, purposeful. Harris stopped, his heart skipping a beat. He turned slowly, his boots scraping the gravel beneath him as he approached the door of the guardhouse. The knock was followed by the sound of boots on the metal stairs, and soon Lieutenant McKinley appeared at the top of the stairs. His face was unreadable, as always, but the tension in his posture told Harris everything he needed to know. "Harris," McKinley said, his voice low but firm, "come with me." Harris's stomach tightened. He followed McKinley into the building, his mind racing. Had anyone seen the exchange? Was the photograph a mistake, or was it something else entirely? McKinley led him into the small office at the back of the guardhouse, the walls cluttered with maps and reports. The air smelled of old paper and cigarettes. McKinley motioned for Harris to sit across from him at the small wooden desk. There was a long moment of silence, just the soft tick of a clock on the wall and the distant murmur of the camp beyond the walls. "Private," McKinley began, leaning forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "We've received reports." Harris's heart sank. "Reports?" he echoed, trying to keep his voice steady. "The prisoners, the ones you're guarding." McKinley's eyes narrowed, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "There's been something unusual going on." Harris felt his throat tighten. "Unusual?" "Sir, I haven't seen anything—" "Don't lie to me," McKinley interrupted, his tone cold. "We know about the photograph, the one you gave to a prisoner this morning." Harris's mind spun. The lieutenant couldn't possibly know. It was a small act, something he had done in the privacy of the camp, and yet here McKinley was, accusing him of it. Harris could feel his palms sweating, his breath coming faster. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the words caught in his throat. Sir, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean?" McKinley repeated, his voice rising now. You broke protocol, Private. You handed over contraband to a POW. That's a serious violation. Do you understand what you've done? Harris swallowed hard, his mind struggling to keep up with the conversation. It wasn't contraband, sir. It was just a photograph, something personal. It didn't harm anyone. Enough, McKinley snapped, slamming his fist onto the desk. You don't get it, do you? These men are the enemy. We're not here to show them kindness, Harris. We're here to keep them in line, to show them who's in charge. Harris's pulse quickened. Sir, I didn't mean to do anything that would harm the mission. You don't get it, Private, McKinley barked, his voice loud and forceful. This isn't about what you think is right. It's about the chain of command, about discipline. You've made a decision that goes against everything we're doing here. You've undermined your position, your responsibility. Harris sat frozen, his mind spinning, but beneath the fear and confusion, a small voice inside him pushed back. It wasn't about undermining authority. It wasn't about breaking protocol. It was about something deeper, something human. But he knew he couldn't say that. Not here. Not now. I understand, sir, Harris muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. McKinley's eyes softened, but only slightly. He leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening again. You'd better hope this doesn't get any worse. If I hear one more whisper about your actions, there will be consequences. Do you understand me, Private? Yes, sir, Harris replied, his voice tight, his jaw clenched. McKinley stood and straightened his uniform, casting one last look at Harris. You're lucky this hasn't escalated. Do your job. And remember, this is a war, not a morality play. You're here to protect this camp, not to play the hero. With that, McKinley turned and left, leaving Harris alone in the room with his thoughts, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him like a physical force. For a long moment, Harris remained seated, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to process everything. The lieutenant's words echoed in his mind, but they didn't feel right. He didn't want to play the hero. He didn't want to be a martyr or a savior. He just wanted to do what felt right. But what felt right was not always what was allowed. And right now, it felt like everything was pulling him in two directions. Harris stood up slowly, his legs stiff, and made his way back to the door. He didn't know what would happen next, but the camp, the prisoners, the photograph, it had all become something far bigger than a single act of kindness. He wasn't sure how far he was willing to go, but one thing was certain. This moment had set something in motion that could never be undone. That night the camp was quieter than usual, a stillness hanging over it that felt unnatural. The wind had picked up, rattling the metal roofs of the barracks and sending a chill through the air. Harris lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling, his body restless despite the exhaustion weighing on him. The routine of the day, patrols, the confrontation with McKinley, had left him unsettled. He turned over, pulling the thin blanket tighter around his shoulders, but it did little to ease the gnawing feeling in his gut. His thoughts kept circling back to the photograph, the way the prisoner's fingers had trembled as he had taken it, the brief moment of connection they had shared. It felt almost surreal now, like something out of a dream. What had he done? Was it worth it? Had he endangered the camp by showing something as simple as compassion? Harris's mind kept racing, torn between the harsh realities of war and the small human act he had allowed himself to perform. It had seemed so simple at the time. He had seen the photograph, the way the man had clutched it to his chest as if it were his only lifeline. It had felt right to return it, to give the man back a piece of his past. But now, with the weight of McKinley's words still echoing in his ears, Harris wasn't so sure. Had he been naive? Was he risking everything for something so trivial? The camp was always filled with the low murmur of activity, guards talking in hushed tones, prisoners moving in and out of sight. But tonight, everything felt muted. The usual clatter of the mess hall was absent, the camp eerily still. Harris could hear the sound of his own breathing, slow and steady, but his mind refused to quiet. His thoughts turned to his family back home. He thought of his mother, how she had always written to him, her letters filled with news from the farm, snippets of everyday life that seemed so distant now. He could almost picture her handwriting, the loops of her words swirling with care and love. Had she been proud when he had enlisted, or had she worried, as he imagined she must have, every night since? Would she have understood why he had done what he did today, or would she have told him to follow orders, to obey without question? The sounds of the camp faded as Harris thought of the life he had left behind, of the simple days on the farm, the smell of fresh hay, the laughter of his brothers, the way his father's strong hands had worked the fields, silent but steadfast. Those days felt so far away now, so distant from the grim reality of the camp. His thoughts drifted back to the prisoner, the man who had held the photograph. He could still see his face, the quiet dignity in his eyes, even when his body was bent low with exhaustion. Was he so different from the men back home? Harris didn't know much about the life of a soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army, but he couldn't imagine it being any more pleasant than his own experience. The men in the camp were human too, no matter the uniform they wore. Harris closed his eyes, trying to shut out the weight of everything, but it was impossible. His mind raced with the consequences of his actions. What if McKinley was right? What if, by showing that small act of kindness, he had weakened the camp's security, made the prisoners believe they could bend the rules, make them think they could manipulate him? Harris's pulse quickened, his chest tightening as the thought settled in his mind. What if he had just made it worse? What if this small mistake would lead to something bigger? He had no idea what the prisoners were capable of, what their plans might be. They were supposed to be contained, broken, but maybe Harris had just given them a crack to slip through. The thought of rebellion, of prisoners gaining control of even the smallest part of the camp, chilled him to the bone. The longer he lay there, the more the doubts crept in. Had he just compromised the safety of everyone in the camp? What if the photograph wasn't just an innocent piece of a soldier's past, but a symbol of something larger, something that could lead to disaster? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door of the guardhouse. Harris's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly sat up, wiping the sweat from his palms. He glanced around, his mind still reeling from the storm of thoughts swirling inside him. He wasn't sure whether it was the camp's routine or if it was something else, but the air felt heavier tonight, the tension palpable. The knock came again, this time followed by the sound of footsteps. Harris stood up, quickly adjusting his uniform as he made his way to the door. The moment his hand touched the handle, his stomach clenched with unease. Was it McKinley again? Was he being summoned for another confrontation? But when Harris opened the door, it wasn't McKinley. It was Dr. Eleanor Wright, the camp physician. She stood in the doorway, her face soft but serious, her eyes holding a quiet understanding. "Private Harris," she said quietly. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Her presence, calm and grounded, was a contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling inside Harris's mind. He nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She didn't wait for an invitation, walking into the room with her usual composed air. She closed the door behind her, her gaze scanning the small space before resting on him. "You look troubled, Doctor," Wright said, her voice gentle but direct. "I wanted to check in on you. You've been distant lately. You're doing a good job here, but I can see something's bothering you." Harris felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized just how much the weight of the day had begun to wear on him. He hadn't realized how much it was beginning to show. I don't know anymore," Harris muttered, his voice rough. He swallowed, trying to find the words. "I did something today. Something that feels wrong now. And I don't know if I should have." Dr. Wright remained silent, giving him space to speak. Harris let out a deep breath, the flood of emotion that had built up finally pouring out. "I gave a prisoner something. A photograph. And now, I'm afraid it could cost us." The next morning, Harris walked through the camp with an odd mixture of dread and determination. The air had grown colder, as if the weather itself sensed the change that had taken place in him. Every step felt heavy, his boots scraping against the gravel with a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness of the camp. He kept his eyes straight ahead, avoiding the gaze of his fellow guards, feeling their silent judgment pressing against him. McKinley's words still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that he had broken a rule, something that couldn't be undone. Harris had tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing. After speaking with Dr. Bright, he knew deep down that it wasn't just about the photograph. It wasn't about breaking protocol or disobeying orders. It was about something far deeper, the need to acknowledge the humanity of the men behind the barbed wire. The thought gnawed at him, no matter how much he tried to suppress it. How could he look at these men and not see them as anything but people, with their own families, their own lives, their own stories? It was during the morning inspection that Harris's resolve solidified. As he walked past the rows of prisoners, his eyes caught the figure he had been avoiding all morning, the man who had held the photograph. The prisoner was standing at attention like all the others, his posture rigid, his eyes on the ground. But there was something different now. There was a subtle shift in the way he held himself. The image of the photograph, the connection between them, was still fresh in Harris's mind, and in that moment he knew what he had to do. His heart pounded as he walked toward the prisoner, who still hadn't noticed him approaching. Harris took a deep breath and stopped just a few feet away from the man. There was no turning back now. His palms were clammy, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. The photograph was still there, hidden, a small but significant piece of someone's life. He didn't know what would happen when he handed it back, but he knew that it had to be done. "Here," Harris said softly, his voice barely audible over the low murmur of the camp. He held the photograph out, offering it without a word of explanation. The prisoner looked up slowly, his eyes meeting Harris's. There was no anger in his gaze, no resentment. Instead, there was something like quiet gratitude, something that made Harris's chest tighten. For a long moment, the prisoner didn't move, as though unsure whether this was some kind of trick. But then, with a hesitant movement, he reached out, taking the photograph with a quiet reverence. His fingers brushed Harris's for just an instant, and in that brief contact, Harris felt a rush of something he couldn't quite name. A connection, a bond that transcended language, nationality, and war. The prisoner didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. There was no need for words. The simple act of returning a photograph had done more than Harris could have imagined. Harris nodded once, unable to speak himself, and turned away. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain it to himself, let alone to anyone else. But as he walked back toward his post, a sense of peace settled over him, however fleeting it might be. The photograph had been returned. The connection had been made. And for the first time since he had arrived at the camp, Harris felt as though he had done something that mattered. As the day wore on, Harris tried to focus on his duties, but the weight of the moment lingered in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of the prisoner's hand, trembling as he took the photograph. It was a simple thing, a small token of a past life, but it had carried with it something far greater, a reminder that no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always room for humanity, even in the most unlikely of places. The other guards didn't notice anything different about him. Sergeant Miller gave him a half-hearted nod as they passed each other on the perimeter. But there was no real acknowledgement. Harris was just another soldier, just another man in a sea of men who had been shaped by the same war. And yet, in that moment, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known before. The world didn't have to be so divided. People didn't have to be enemies. They were all part of the same struggle, the same story. As the sun began to set, casting a warm orange light over the camp, Harris found himself standing at the edge of the barracks, staring out over the wire fence. The prisoners were gathered in their usual formation, the officers standing watch, the air thick with the tension of daily life in captivity. Yet something had changed, and it was impossible to ignore. There was a shift in the way the prisoners moved, in the way they interacted with each other. They seemed calmer, more collected, as though something within them had been given back. Harris didn't know what would come of this small act of kindness. He didn't know what the future held, whether it would make a difference in the grand scheme of things, but for the first time he felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose, of connection, of understanding that stretched beyond the rigid walls of the camp. He walked away, his steps lighter than they had been in days. He didn't know if he had done the right thing. He didn't know if it would change anything, But it had mattered to him, and maybe, just maybe, it had mattered to the prisoner as well. The hours that followed Harris's quiet exchange with the prisoner were filled with a tense, almost unbearable stillness. The camp, usually a buzzing hub of activity, felt muted, as if everyone had collectively held their breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The prisoners went about their routines as usual, heads lowered, bodies stiff and controlled. The guards continued their patrols, their footsteps echoing across the gravel paths. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a shift, one that was hard to ignore. Harris couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was something different in the air. The prisoners no longer seemed as distant, as unreachable. There was a slight change in their posture, a subtle shift in the way they carried themselves. For the first time, Harris noticed the quiet solidarity between them, how they stood together, shoulder to shoulder, eyes focused ahead, but their movements were measured, almost cautious, as though they were awaiting a signal from someone. He couldn't shake the feeling that the simple act of returning the photograph had sparked something among them. It wasn't until later that afternoon that Harris realized just how much the exchange had affected the camp. As he walked past the row of prisoners, he noticed a subtle shift in their behavior. It wasn't immediately obvious, just a slight change in the way they carried themselves. They seemed more alert, more present, as if something deep inside them had stirred. The guards, too, seemed to notice. Sergeant Miller gave Harris a sharp, curious glance, his eyes narrowing as he studied the prisoners more intently. But there was no sign of rebellion, no outward show of defiance. It was a quiet transformation, one that went unnoticed by most, but not by Harris. He felt the change, subtle as it was, like a spark in the air. He couldn't explain it, but it was as though the prisoners were no longer just faces behind the wire, no longer just enemies. They were something more. People, men with lives beyond the camp, with stories and memories that stretched far beyond the confines of the barbed wire that held them. And in that small, quiet exchange, Harris had done something that had broken down a wall, at least for a moment. That evening, as the camp settled into its usual quiet routine, Harris found himself standing on his post, his thoughts still swirling. The photograph, the small act of returning it, kept replaying in his mind. He had expected to feel guilt or fear, to be haunted by McKinley's reprimand, but instead he felt something else, something unexpected. There was a sense of relief, almost like a weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't that he had suddenly become naive or foolish. He hadn't forgotten the harsh realities of the camp, the war, the rules that governed everything. But in that brief moment, he had acted on something that felt like the right thing to do. And in a world so full of violence and loss, that small act felt like a lifeline. It wasn't long before Harris noticed that the other guards were beginning to whisper among themselves. It wasn't the first time they had done so, of course. The men here were always on edge, always looking for signs of weakness or insubordination, but today there was something different in their whispers, something charged. Harris tried to focus on his duties, tried to block out the low murmur of voices that seemed to follow him wherever he went, but he couldn't. The unease was palpable. "Hey, Harris," Sergeant Miller called from across the perimeter. His voice was low but sharp, and it sent a jolt of tension through Harris's chest. "Get over here." Harris hesitated, his heart skipping a beat. Was it about the photograph? Was McKinley going to get wind of it again? He took a deep breath and made his way toward Miller, trying to keep his expression neutral. Miller stood with his arms crossed, his face set in a hard, impassive mask. He didn't speak right away, just looked at Harris with those calculating eyes, sizing him up as though trying to gauge his response. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Miller finally spoke. "You know, the prisoners aren't stupid," Miller said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "They're picking up on things. It's not just the way they're acting, it's the way you're acting, too." Harris swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Miller's words settle heavily on his chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miller continued, stepping closer, his voice dropping even lower, "you've been too soft on them. The way you looked at that one earlier, the way you gave him that damn photograph, the others saw it. And they'll be thinking you're an easy target." Harris felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had known there would be consequences for what he had done, But hearing it from Miller, hearing the doubt in his voice, made it real in a way that McKinley's reprimand hadn't. "I was just trying to do the right thing," Harris said quietly, his voice barely audible. Miller scoffed. "The right thing? What's the right thing in a place like this, Harris? You're not here to make friends with the enemy. You're here to keep them in line." Harris met Miller's gaze, his heart racing. He knew that Miller was right. He wasn't here to make friends, but he wasn't sure that what he had done had been wrong either. "Don't let your emotions get in the way of your duty," Miller said, his voice hard. "If you want to keep your position here, you'll remember who you're supposed to be protecting, and it sure as hell isn't them." Harris felt a lump rise in his throat, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he simply nodded and turned away. He wasn't sure what to think anymore. He wasn't sure who he was supposed to be protecting. As the night settled over the camp, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift in a way he couldn't control. The weight of the prisoner's gaze, the hushed whispers of the guards, it all hung over him like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment, and he didn't know if he was ready for whatever came next. The morning light broke through the low grey clouds, casting a muted glow over the camp. A stiff breeze whipped across the fields, rustling the thin leaves of the few trees that had survived the harsh climate. Harris stood on his patrol, the sharp wind biting at his face, but his mind was far from the cold morning. Instead, it lingered on the events of the past few days. The photograph, the confrontation with Miller, and the uneasy tension that had begun to spread through the camp like wildfire. Everything felt different now. Even the air seemed to carry a heavier weight, as though the camp itself had been changed by something that no one could quite put into words. Harris couldn't shake the sense that something was brewing, something just out of reach but undeniable. The prisoners, too, seemed different. There was a quiet energy about them, an alertness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, but something in their demeanor had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Harris caught sight of Takeda, the captain of the Japanese prisoners, standing with his fellow men in a small group near the barracks. The older man had always carried himself with an air of quiet authority, but now there was something else, something more, a weight behind his gaze that Harris hadn't noticed before. Takeda's eyes met Harris's briefly, and for the first time there was no defiance, no cold wariness. Instead, there was something like respect. Harris quickly looked away, feeling the heat rise in his face. What was happening here? Why did it feel as though everything was changing, even though nothing on the surface had shifted? He didn't have long to dwell on the question. The sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed through the camp. It was a sound that Harris knew all too well, footsteps of the other guards, approaching in formation, their sharp movements cutting through the stillness. But this time, something was different. The prisoners, who normally stood in rigid lines, heads bowed, waiting to be inspected, began to gather together. Slowly at first, and then with growing confidence, the men began to form an unspoken circle. There was no command, no orders given, just a quiet movement, as though they were responding to something only they understood. Harris froze, his heart hammering in his chest. What was happening? Why were they gathering? This was something that had never occurred before in the camp. The prisoners were supposed to stand in their designated areas, not come together like this. His instincts screamed at him to intervene, to break it up before it turned into something worse. But something stopped him. He wasn't the only one who had noticed. The other guards stood a little straighter, their eyes flicking nervously between the prisoners and one another. Sergeant Miller, who had been walking ahead, turned on his heel, his hand resting on the grip of his rifle. His sharp gaze swept over the scene, his jaw tightening. "What the hell is going on?" Miller muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the wind. Harris didn't answer. He didn't know what was going on. He had never seen anything like this before. But he knew that this was a moment. Something was about to happen, something big, and he couldn't tell if it was going to end in peace or violence. The prisoners stood in their circle now, silently, as though waiting for something to happen. The quietness was oppressive, thick with tension. Harris's breath quickened, his thoughts racing. Was this the start of an uprising? Had the return of the photograph, the small act of compassion, somehow sparked this moment? He couldn't be sure, but the gathering felt like a silent challenge, as if the prisoners were testing something, testing him, testing the boundaries of the camp's authority. Then, without warning, Takeda stepped forward. His movements were deliberate, calm, as though he had expected this moment all along. Harris's pulse quickened. Was this it? Was Takeda about to speak, to incite his fellow prisoners to act? The older man's gaze swept over his men, his eyes lingering for a moment on Harris, who stood frozen at the edge of the scene. Takeda bowed, just a slight measured dip of his head, a gesture that held weight beyond simple formality. It was a bow of respect, but also of something more. It was a message. Harris could feel it deep in his chest like a tangible force in the air, and then something even more unexpected happened. The other prisoners, one by one, began to bow as well. It wasn't a spontaneous movement. It was controlled, unified, like they had been rehearsing it for days. Dozens of men, heads lowered in that shared gesture of respect, bowed in unison before Harris, before him, the American guard. Harris's heart stopped. He stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. The action hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't rebellion, it wasn't a threat, it wasn't defiance. It was something different, a quiet, powerful gesture of acknowledgement. The men before him, their eyes now downcast, had done something that none of the other guards could have predicted. They had recognized him, not as an enemy or a soldier, but as something more, a fellow human, someone capable of understanding the simplest of human connections. The photograph, the exchange, it had meant something to them, it had bridged a gap. Harris felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a blanket, pressing in on his chest, suffocating him. The world around him seemed to fall away, leaving only the prisoners and their quiet bows. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to respond. There was no protocol for this, no orders to follow. All he could do was stand there, feeling the eyes of his fellow guards on him, their confusion and uncertainty mirrored in his own. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it ended. The prisoners straightened, returning to their positions, their movements deliberate as though nothing had changed. But Harris knew it had. The camp would never be the same. The rest of the day passed in a haze of confusion and unspoken tension. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irreversibly in the camp. The prisoners had bowed to him, dozens of men, their heads lowered in a quiet act of respect, and it had caught him off guard. But the longer he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. What did it mean? Why had they chosen him, of all people, to show this kind of gesture? As the hours dragged on, he felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on his chest. The camp was quieter now, the usual hum of activity muted under the blanket of a growing uncertainty. The other guards kept their distance from him, avoiding eye contact or offering only the briefest of nods. It wasn't just the prisoners who had noticed something. The guards had felt the change too. Sergeant Miller was the first to confront him. The older man approached Harris during a quiet moment, standing just a few feet away, his posture rigid, arms crossed tightly across his chest. His eyes were narrowed, studying Harris like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You got a lot of explaining to do, Private," Miller said, his voice low but sharp. His words cut through the quiet like a knife. Harris shifted on his feet, unease curling in his stomach. "I didn't do anything wrong," he replied, but his voice sounded uncertain even to himself. Miller's lips twisted into a thin, humorless smile. "Right. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't break protocol, didn't get all sentimental over some damn photograph." He took a step closer, his breath carrying the faint scent of tobacco. "But those men, those prisoners, they saw something in you. They saw weakness." Harris stiffened, his pulse quickening. "That's not what happened," he said, his voice growing firmer, though doubt lingered. "It wasn't weakness. It was compassion," Miller interrupted, the bitterness in his tone cutting through Harris's words. "You think you can show them kindness, and that makes everything better. They'll walk all over you, Harris. They'll see you as an opening, a crack in the armor. And once they start pushing, who's going to be the one who pays for it?" Harris didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, trying to push away the feeling that Miller might be right. He had known deep down that there would be consequences for what he had done, but he hadn't expected this. The bowing, the silent acknowledgement from the prisoners. It wasn't supposed to lead to anything like this. It wasn't supposed to change things between him and the other guards. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Miller continued, his voice growing more forceful. "This is war, Harris. You don't get to play by your own rules. You're here to keep them in check, not to play hero." Harris swallowed, the weight of Miller's words pressing down on him. He wasn't naive, he knew what war was about, he knew the stakes. But there had been something about the photograph, something about seeing the prisoner's eyes that made him act the way he did. The respect in that quiet bow, it was more than just an act of submission. It was a recognition of something deeper, something shared. But was that enough to change everything? "I'm just trying to do what feels right," Harris finally said, his voice barely a whisper. Miller's face hardened. "You're not paid to feel right. You're paid to do your job, and if you can't do that, then maybe you don't belong here." Harris opened his mouth to argue, but Miller cut him off, his words like a final sentence. "Don't make me go to McKinley about this. You're walking on thin ice, Harris." As Miller turned away, Harris stood rooted to the spot, the weight of his words sinking in. He had been walking the line between his own sense of right and the harsh demands of duty, but now it felt as though the line had blurred beyond recognition. It wasn't just the prisoners he had to worry about anymore. It was the men on his side, the ones he was supposed to trust. The rest of the day passed in a blur, with Harris keeping his distance from the other guards, unable to shake the lingering tension. Every time he passed Miller, or any of the other soldiers, their eyes would flicker toward him as if silently questioning his loyalty, his resolve. No one said anything aloud, but the unspoken judgment was enough to make Harris feel more isolated than he ever had before. Later that evening, as he walked past the barracks, he saw the prisoners again, lined up for their evening roll call. Takeda was at the front, his posture as commanding as ever, his eyes scanning the group with quiet authority. For a moment, their eyes met, and Harris felt an unsettling sense of connection. It was as if Takeda understood something that he didn't. The prisoners, too, seemed different. The tension that had been in their movements earlier had shifted to something more like quiet purpose. They stood a little straighter, their eyes focused ahead, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for the next move in a game they were all playing. But Harris couldn't tell if they were waiting for an opportunity to escape, or if they were simply biding their time, holding on to whatever shred of dignity they could find in a world where it seemed there was none. Harris's stomach tightened as he passed them, his boots scraping against the gravel. The sound was sharp in the stillness of the evening. There was a moment of silence as he walked by, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of earlier. This was different. The prisoners, though still locked behind the wire, no longer felt like strangers to him. There was a recognition between them now, a silent understanding that neither side could ignore. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing. Nothing in the camp would ever be the same. The next few days passed in a haze of uneasy silence. The camp's routine continued, guards standing watch, prisoners moving through their assigned tasks, the hum of the camp never truly quieting. But Harris couldn't shake the weight of what had transpired. The prisoners' gesture, their bowing, their acknowledgement, had lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. He had hoped it might fade, that time would erase the strangeness of it, but it didn't. If anything, it only deepened the confusion. He tried to keep his focus on the task at hand, but his thoughts kept returning to that moment. The prisoners had not rebelled, they had not tried to escape, but they had acted with purpose. And now, more than ever, the lines between guard and prisoner seemed blurred, their roles no longer as clear-cut as they once were. It was during one of these restless nights that Harris found himself walking past the barracks again. The air had grown cooler, the camp still as ever, and there was a heaviness that seemed to hang in the air. He wasn't sure why he was walking. He was off duty, after all. But something had drawn him out of his quarters, something that felt like a pull. As he passed the barracks, he noticed Takeda standing just outside, his back straight and his eyes scanning the camp with a quiet intensity. For a moment they locked eyes, and Harris felt a strange, almost involuntary sense of respect rising within him. Takeda held the gaze for a beat longer than expected before he bowed, just a slight dip of his head, the kind of gesture that felt less like an act of submission and more like an invitation. Harris stopped, his feet frozen to the ground. The night air pressed in, thick and full of unspoken tension. Takeda's gesture had felt like more than just a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of something shared, something that transcended the camp, the war, and the distance that separated them. Without thinking, Harris stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the small, tattered photograph in his jacket pocket. He had carried it with him ever since that day. The photograph, his only connection to the man who had given it to him, had become a symbol, a link that tied him to something outside of this place, something human. He wasn't sure why he had kept it, but in that moment standing there facing Takeda, it felt like the right thing to do. Takeda watched him silently, his expression unreadable but not unfriendly. Harris hesitated, unsure of what to say or how to explain this strange impulse, but Takeda seemed to understand without words. He nodded once, a silent invitation for Harris to speak. Harris took a deep breath. This belonged to one of your men," he said, his voice rough with uncertainty. "I think it's time it went back to him." He handed the photograph to Takeda. For a moment their fingers brushed, another fleeting connection, but one that felt charged with something important. Takeda took the photograph gently, his fingers lingering on it for a moment, before he tucked it into the folds of his jacket. "Thank you," Takeda said quietly, his voice calm but carrying a weight of gratitude that Harris hadn't expected. It wasn't just a thank you for returning a photograph, it was something deeper. It was a thank you for seeing them, for acknowledging their humanity in a place where that had been stripped away. For the first time, Harris truly understood what the bowing had meant. It wasn't a gesture of submission, it was a recognition of respect. The prisoners were not just faceless enemies, but men who had their own stories, their own lives that stretched beyond the camp. They weren't just soldiers, they were people. And in that moment, standing there with Takeda, Harris realized that the walls between them were not as impenetrable as he had once thought. Takeda's eyes met Harris's one last time, and for a brief moment Harris saw something that he had never expected to see. Peace. It was fleeting, but it was there, a quiet understanding passing between them. Takeda didn't say anything more, but Harris didn't need him to. He turned and walked away, his heart pounding with the weight of the exchange. There was something powerful in that brief moment, something that had shifted, not just between him and Takeda, but within himself. He hadn't just returned a photograph, he had crossed a bridge, one that he hadn't even known existed. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, though Harris knew the camp would never be free of its tension. He didn't know what the future held, whether this small act of understanding would lead to anything more, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this war than orders and duty. Maybe there was a way to see the humanity in the people around him, both the prisoners and the men in his own camp. As Harris returned to his quarters, the photograph still heavy in his pocket, he realized that the war wasn't just fought on the battlefield. It was fought in small moments of connection, of seeing one another for who they truly were. And in that brief exchange, Harris had learned that even in the darkest of places, the smallest gestures could hold more power than he had ever imagined. The next day, the weight of what had transpired settled heavily on Harris's shoulders. Though the sun was shining and the camp had resumed its usual routine, nothing felt quite the same. Every step he took felt laden with the quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud, waiting to break. The small moment of connection with Takeda and the prisoners still lingered in his thoughts, but so did the dark undercurrents that were beginning to stir among the other guards. Harris had hoped that, in some way, things might change, that maybe, just maybe, the simple act of returning the photograph would make a difference, both to the prisoners and to his fellow soldiers. But the reality was harsher than that. The camp's routine hadn't shifted in any noticeable way. The prisoners still moved under watchful eyes, their every step controlled, their silence deepened. But the guards? The tension among them was undeniable. Sergeant Miller, who had always been quick to find fault, was on Harris again the moment he caught sight of him. His eyes were sharp, filled with something dark. Resentment, maybe. Harris had expected the fallout, but it still stung. Miller was always watching him now, a critical eye trained on his every move. "You're walking a fine line, Private," Miller said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable threat. "Do you think you can just go around handing out photographs, sharing little moments of kindness, and everything will be fine? You're fooling yourself." Harris stiffened, his heart racing. "I didn't mean any harm, Sergeant. I just thought—" "Stop right there," Miller cut him off. His voice was sharp like a whip crack. "You think they're gonna be grateful? You think those men are just sitting there waiting for you to see them? They're soldiers. And they're still the enemy. You've got no place in playing their game, Harris." Harris clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. His thoughts swirled, mixing the words of Miller with his own doubts. The respect he had seen in Takeda's eyes, the silent gratitude in the prisoner's bow, was it just a facade? Had he been naive to think that something as small as a photograph could change anything? "I wasn't playing their game," Harris replied, his voice steady but unsure. I didn't want to treat them like animals." Miller's expression soured. "And you think that's going to get you anywhere? You think those men are going to start thinking you're one of them, that they're going to start trusting you? You're a guard, Harris. That's your job. You're here to keep them in line, not to get all sentimental." Harris bit back a response, but it wasn't anger that burned in his chest. It was doubt. He had acted in good faith. He had tried to make a connection, and now it felt like he had made a mistake. He had crossed a line, one he wasn't sure he could uncross. As Miller walked away, muttering something under his breath, Harris stood frozen. The weight of the conversation hung heavily on him, mixing with the growing sense of isolation that had settled over him since he'd returned the photograph. It wasn't just Miller's words that lingered. It was the way his fellow guards now looked at him, the silent judgment in their eyes. It wasn't as if they'd confronted him directly, they didn't need to. The suspicion was written all over their faces. He had become a liability, a weak link in the chain of command. Harris's thoughts were interrupted by the low murmur of voices coming from the prisoners' barracks. He turned, looking in their direction. The group was larger today, their formation more cohesive. Takeda was standing at the front again, speaking softly to his men, though from this distance Harris couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. He knew what they were talking about. They were plotting something. He could feel it. The subtle change in the air, the way they moved as one, it was no longer about survival. It was about resistance. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The prisoners were no longer just waiting. They were organizing. And it was his act, the one small, seemingly innocent exchange with Takeda, that had set it all into motion. Harris turned away, his stomach tight with fear and confusion. The war had never been so personal, so close. And now he couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a much larger game. The photograph had done something. But what had it really changed? Later that evening, as he walked his patrol, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The prisoners were different. They weren't as subdued, as passive. There was something in the air, an undercurrent of energy that hummed beneath the surface. The guards were too close to it to see it, but Harris could feel it. He didn't know what the prisoners were planning, but he knew it wouldn't be long before whatever it was came to a head. And as he walked past Takeda once more, the prisoner's eyes met his, calm, calculating, as though the events of the last few days had all led to this moment. Harris's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow bursts. This wasn't just about him anymore. He had unwittingly become a part of something bigger. "Private Harris," Takeda said quietly, his voice a mere whisper carried by the wind. Harris froze, his throat tightening. Takeda was watching him, a subtle nod of acknowledgement passing between them. The moment felt heavy, like it carried the weight of everything that had transpired since the photograph had first crossed his hands. Harris didn't know what Takeda's gesture meant, but in that instant he knew something had changed. The question remained, what would happen next, and where did he, as a soldier, fit into it? The days that followed the quiet exchange between Harris and Takeda felt both heavier and lighter at once. The air in the camp had changed, but not in any obvious way. There were no grand gestures or loud confrontations. It was the subtle things that weighed on Harris, the way the prisoners stood a little taller, the way the guards looked at him with more suspicion, the way he couldn't escape the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface. Harris kept his distance from the other guards. He had learned to keep his thoughts to himself, to avoid confrontation, but the guilt lingered. The small act of compassion he had shown had created a ripple, and now he wasn't sure how far that ripple would go. The prisoners were still under control, still locked behind the wire, but the cracks were starting to show. The prisoners, who had once appeared as defeated as their situation, now had a quiet purpose to their movements. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, but it felt like something was being quietly prepared, waiting for the right moment. Sergeant Miller's warnings haunted him, echoing in the back of his mind like a constant drumbeat. He had been right about one thing: Harris was walking a fine line. The respect he had earned from the prisoners through his small gesture was undeniable, but in the eyes of the other guards, it made him a liability. They didn't understand the connection, the bond that had been forged in that single moment of recognition. They saw weakness, and in a place like this, weakness was dangerous. The camp continued its rhythm, men working, men watching. The prisoners shuffled from one task to another, their eyes always cast downward. But Harris noticed something he hadn't seen before. They moved in smaller groups now, huddled together, speaking in low voices. It wasn't open defiance, but it was something, an undercurrent that hummed just below the surface. Takeda, who had once been an isolated figure, now stood with a quiet authority, commanding respect not only from his fellow prisoners, but from the guards too. Harris saw it in the way the men watched him when he walked by, the nods they exchanged when he made his rounds. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was something more complex, something Harris couldn't name, but something he couldn't ignore. It wasn't until the following week that Harris realized how much respect had truly shifted. He had been walking past the prisoners' work detail when he noticed Takeda and a few others looking at him with a kind of quiet understanding. The brief exchange of glances was enough to send a shiver down his spine. Takeda's eyes locked with his, steady and unwavering. And for the first time, Harris saw something different there, something less guarded, less calculating. It was a softening, a change in how they viewed each other. It wasn't just the acknowledgement of one man's kindness, it was the recognition of shared humanity. Takeda wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was a man who, for a brief moment, had shown Harris what it meant to stand with dignity. Later that day, Harris found himself walking toward the mess hall when he caught sight of Takeda again. This time there were no words between them, no gesture, just a brief, shared moment of recognition. Takeda was standing near a fence, speaking quietly with one of the younger prisoners. But when their eyes met, there was something there that wasn't there before, a silent understanding that went beyond the walls of the camp, beyond the roles they had been forced to play. Harris felt a pang of something deep inside, a flicker of hope, perhaps, or the first stirring of respect. It wasn't something that could be explained easily, not even to himself. He had been trained to see enemies in the men behind the barbed wire, but now he was starting to see something else, something human. They were all human. The prisoners, the guards, even the men who stood at the gates, keeping watch over them. The war had stripped them of everything, yet in these brief moments they were still capable of seeing one another. The realization hit him harder than he expected, as if something had clicked inside of him. The walls between them were still there, thick, iron, unyielding, but there was something else now, something that went beyond the uniforms, beyond the orders they followed. There was respect, shared and unspoken, but it was real. Later, when Harris went to stand post, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something inevitable. The respect had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated, not only from the prisoners, but from his fellow guards too. It wasn't something he could easily explain, but it was something he could feel. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but it was clear that it had begun to change him. And the more he watched the prisoners, saw them not as faceless enemies but as men, fathers, sons, brothers, the more he understood that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had intended. The next day, he found himself once again walking past Takeda's group of prisoners. This time the air between them felt different. The tension had eased slightly, replaced by something quieter, something that felt almost like an unspoken truce. Takeda gave him a brief nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, and for the first time, Harris didn't feel the weight of judgment on him. There was no suspicion in Takeda's gaze, no mistrust. Only a quiet understanding, as though they both knew that the lines they had drawn in the sand could no longer hold. As Harris walked on, the camp's sounds, quiet as they were, seemed to change. There was a new rhythm in the air, something softer, something more hopeful. It was still war. It was still a prison. But in that brief moment, Harris knew that there was more to it than duty, than orders, than fear. There was respect, and that, in a place like this, was something he had never expected to find. Days bled into each other, each one like the last. Yet Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something within him had irrevocably changed. The rhythms of the camp, the monotony of the watchtower, and the measured steps of the prisoners, it all seemed the same. But nothing felt the same to him anymore. It was as though the weight of his choices, the simple decisions he had made over the past few weeks, had settled into his bones. Each one of them added up, shifting something deep inside him. The camp had not changed, at least not outwardly. The prisoners still moved about their daily routines, heads bowed in silence, their lives controlled by the iron grip of war. The guards still stood post, watched over the prisoners with sharp eyes, and followed their orders without question. But Harris began to notice the small ways things were different. It was in the way Takeda's eyes lingered on him, a quiet understanding between them that transcended the bars that separated them. It was in the way the prisoners no longer seemed quite so lost, so broken. There was a new solidarity among them, one that had been sparked by something so small yet so powerful. A photograph returned with respect. He couldn't help but think of his family back home, the letters they had sent him filled with news of the farm, the changing seasons. His mother's letters had been full of love, full of hope, urging him to return safe. And he had always promised her he would. But now, the man he was when he first left for the war, the naive farm boy who had joined because he was told to, seemed so far removed from who he had become. He had changed slowly, through the simple gestures of his days in the camp, moments of humanity that went unnoticed by most but not by him. Harris stood at the watchtower one morning, the wind biting against his face. The day was grey like so many before it, but the silence felt different. It was more profound, more introspective. As he scanned the rows of prisoners, the same faces, the same men who had once been nothing more than enemies to him, now looked more like people. They moved with purpose, their eyes no longer just downcast in fear, but focused, steady. There was a quiet dignity about them that had not been there before, and it unsettled him. His thoughts drifted back to the photograph, the single most powerful thing he had ever held in his hands. It wasn't just a photograph anymore. It had become a symbol of something deeper, a link between two worlds that had once been too far apart to ever touch. The fact that he had returned it, that simple act of returning something personal to a man who was not his enemy, had unlocked something in both the prisoner and himself. As Harris stood there, watching the prisoners move about, he began to see them differently. No longer were they faceless men who had been captured by the enemy. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also fathers, brothers, sons, just as he had been. They were men who had fought for their country, who had lost just as much as he had. The photograph, that moment, had opened his eyes to the humanity he had refused to see before. He couldn't go back to the way things were. He couldn't pretend that this was just another day in the camp, that the divisions between them were as clear-cut as they had once seemed. He had crossed a line. The problem was that now he wasn't sure how to go back to being the guard who stood on the other side of the wire watching without care. He wasn't sure he could look at the prisoners the same way again, and he wasn't sure he could keep pretending to be the man who followed orders without question. The next time he walked through the camp, He saw the same faces, but there was something different in the way they looked at him. It wasn't just fear, it wasn't the same guarded mistrust. There was a flicker of recognition there, a silent acknowledgement that somehow they knew he had seen them. He had noticed them not as the enemy, but as men. Harris didn't know what it meant, but it felt like a turning point. The respect he had earned wasn't just from one prisoner, it was from all of them. The unspoken bond that had formed, the small moments of connection between the prisoners and him, had changed something deep inside the camp. And it had changed him. Later that evening, he sat alone on his cot, his hands clasped in his lap. The quiet of the camp surrounded him, but it felt different now. The stillness wasn't oppressive, it was contemplative. Harris realized, for the first time since arriving at the camp, that he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He wasn't just a guard following orders. He had become part of something bigger. The small act of returning the photograph, of seeing beyond the uniform, had transformed him into something new. He had begun to see the world, not in black and white, not in the harsh lines of enemy and ally, but in shades of grey. Harris wasn't sure where this transformation would lead, but he knew one thing. He couldn't go back. Not now. He had seen too much, felt too much. The man who had walked into this camp was no longer the same as the one who stood here now. He had changed irrevocably, and he had no idea how to stop the transformation. But somehow that didn't scare him anymore. The camp had settled into a tense kind of rhythm, but Harris was no longer just another part of it. The days had become indistinguishable, but within him something had shifted. Every glance he shared with a prisoner, every silent exchange made the walls that had once separated him from them feel thinner, less imposing. The connection between him and the men behind the wire wasn't just a fleeting moment anymore. It was something deeper, something permanent. But Harris couldn't shake the weight of the choices he had made. McKinley's warning still echoed in his mind, louder than ever. The army had one set of rules, but those rules didn't account for the grey areas of humanity, the moments that could never be neatly categorized or understood. Harris had stepped outside those boundaries, small, seemingly insignificant actions, but those moments had built up, shaping him in ways he didn't know how to describe. The respect he had gained from the prisoners wasn't just a gesture. It was a bridge that had been built between them, one that would never be erased. Still, he couldn't ignore the tension that hung between him and his fellow guards. Miller was always watching, his eyes sharp and calculating. The others were more distant, unsure of how to approach him now. He was no longer just a soldier. He had become something else, someone who had crossed lines that were never meant to be crossed. The soldiers who had once stood beside him now viewed him as a question mark, something they couldn't quite figure out. One morning, as Harris walked through the camp, he noticed the subtle shifts in the prisoners. The silent nods they gave each other, the small exchanges of glances. Takeda, standing in the front, was no longer just the commanding officer of the prisoners. He was a leader in the truest sense of the word, a man who had commanded respect through nothing more than his quiet dignity. The men under his charge moved with purpose now, their eyes no longer just looking down at the ground in submission. There was strength in their stance, something Harris hadn't seen before. He passed by them and saw Takeda's eyes meet his once more. There was no hostility, no coldness, just that silent recognition, that understanding. For the first time since Harris had arrived at the camp, he felt like he belonged in the moment, not as a guard, not as an enemy, but as a man. As he continued his walk, Harris's mind wandered back to the photograph. It seemed so small now, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But it wasn't the photograph that had changed everything. It was the act of returning it, the acknowledgement of shared humanity. It was the moment when he saw the prisoners not as faceless enemies, but as people who had lost everything, just as he had. And yet, they had found a way to hold on to something that Harris was only beginning to understand. Later that evening, when Harris sat alone in his quarters, the stillness of the camp surrounding him, he realized that the photograph was no longer the only symbol. The act of returning it had sparked something within him that couldn't be undone. It had made him question everything he had been taught, everything he had believed about duty and loyalty. He had entered this war thinking that it was about right and wrong, black and white, but now it felt like everything had become a series of shades, blurred together in ways he couldn't have imagined. The camp was still a prison, still a place where men were confined by war, by duty, by the weight of their pasts, but Harris no longer saw it as just that. He saw the moments that connected them, the silent understanding between enemies, the subtle bonds that had been formed and would continue to grow. The respect he had earned from the prisoners wasn't just a formality. It was a bridge that once built could never be torn down. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if this fragile connection between the guards and the prisoners would ever mean anything beyond the camp walls. But he knew this. He had crossed a line, and in doing so, he had discovered something he hadn't known was missing, something essential to the very nature of war and humanity. When Harry stood at his post that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the camp, he no longer felt like a guard. He didn't feel like an enemy either. He was simply a man, standing among men, who had found a sliver of respect, a quiet understanding, in a place where both had seemed impossible. And in that moment he realized that, for the first time, he wasn't just following orders. He was living in the space between them, between the rules and the humanity he had learned to see. He had crossed that bridge, and he wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he couldn't turn back. Not now.